The worn floral armchair, its springs groaning a final protest, landed with a soft, pathetic thud in a drift of fresh snow. It was the first piece of her life to be exiled, and Eleanor Vance watched it happen from the cracked walkway, her small frame swallowed by a threadbare gray coat. The air was the color of lead, thick with the promise of more snow, and each falling flake felt like a grain of salt on an open wound. Her breath plumed in front of her face, a fleeting ghost of the life still inside her. Around her, the quiet suburban street held its own breath. Curtains twitched in the windows of the neighboring houses, silent eyes peering out at the spectacle of a life being dismantled on a frozen lawn. No one came out. No one offered a word. They were merely spectators at the slow, methodical execution of her home. The executioner was Mr. Sterling, the landlord, a man whose warmth was reserved exclusively for the thermostat in his office. He stood on the porch, directing two sullen-looking men who hauled her possessions from the doorway. He wore an expensive camel hair coat, utterly impractical for the task, its collar turned up against a wind that seemed to bother him more than the eviction itself. "Careful with that," he'd bark, not out of concern for the item, but for the potential liability if one of his men slipped. He gestured with a leather-gloved hand. "Just put it on the curb. All of it. The city can haul it away as trash if she doesn't." His voice was crisp, businesslike, and loud enough for the listening windows to hear. He was performing his righteousness, a man simply following the rules. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't cry or plead. The time for that had passed in a series of ignored letters and unanswered phone calls. Now there was only this quiet, public stripping away of everything that had made her life hers. She watched as a floor lamp, its shade slightly askew like a tilted hat, joined the armchair. Then came boxes, dozens of them, labeled in her late husband's neat, blocky handwriting. Kitchen, Frank's books, summer clothes. Each one that landed in the snow was a fresh stab of memory. The men worked with a grim, detached efficiency, their faces impassive. They were just doing a job. They avoided looking at her. It was easier that way. The final humiliation came in the form of a small cardboard box, weakened by years of storage in a damp closet. As one of the movers carelessly tossed it toward the growing pile, the bottom gave way. A cascade of photographs, a lifetime of captured moments, spilled out across the pristine white snow. A young Eleanor and Frank on their wedding day, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. A black and white picture of a much younger Frank in his army uniform, his smile confident and proud. A faded color snapshot of them standing beside a gleaming motorcycle, the chrome so bright it seemed to generate its own light. The images lay scattered, faces of the past staring up at the merciless gray sky, their joy muted by the cold. Mr. Sterling clicked his tongue in annoyance. "Clean that mess up," he ordered, not to his men, but to her. For the first time, Eleanor moved. She walked slowly, deliberately, and knelt in the snow, her frozen fingers beginning the impossible task of gathering the scattered pieces of her heart. The silence from the houses around her felt louder now, heavier, a thick blanket of judgment and fear. Mr. Sterling watched her, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. He was a man who believed in ledgers and bottom lines, in rules that were as inflexible as iron. Empathy was a liability, a weakness he had long ago excised from his business model. He saw not a grieving widow in an impossible situation, but a deficit on a spreadsheet. 2 months in arrears, Mrs. Vance, he announced to the street, his voice carrying the weight of unassailable logic. "I sent notices. I made calls. This is the unfortunate but necessary outcome of failing to meet one's obligations." He adjusted his silk scarf, a small, fussy gesture that underscored his detachment from the raw, human wreckage he was creating. His words were a shield, meant to deflect any potential criticism from the unseen jury behind the windows. He was not a villain. He was an administrator of consequences. Eleanor did not look up. Her world had shrunk to the small, frozen square of snow in front of her, to the faces of the people she had loved. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with a photograph of Frank laughing, his head thrown back, a wrench in his hand. The chill of the snow-covered paper seeped into her skin, a cold that went deeper than the weather. It was the cold of absolute loneliness. Sterling took a step off the porch, his expensive leather shoes sinking slightly into the snow. He loomed over her. "I need the property cleared. You can't just leave this junk here. It's an eyesore. It lowers the value for everyone." He used the word junk with a casual cruelty that was more painful than any shout. The carefully packed boxes, the furniture that had held their bodies, the photographs that held their souls. It was all just junk. To punctuate his point, he nudged a small, dark wooden box with the toe of his shoe. The box skittered across the icy ground, stopping near the tilted floor lamp. It was a small, almost insignificant gesture, but for Eleanor, it was a physical blow. Her head snapped up, her eyes, clear and gray as the winter sky, finally meeting his. There was no fear in them, no pleading. There was only a profound, sorrowful stillness. The look unsettled him more than tears would have. He saw a flicker of something he didn't recognize, something hard and unbreakable beneath the surface of the frail old woman. He had expected her to shatter, but she was merely bending under the weight. A few doors down, a teenager filming the scene on his phone let out a small, nervous snicker, quickly stifled by a sharp word from his mother. A woman walking her dog crossed the street, pulling her child close as if poverty were a contagious disease. Each averted gaze, each silent retreat, reinforced the wall of isolation around Eleanor. Sterling, feeling his audience's wavering attention, felt a need to reassert his authority. "I'm a patient man, Mrs. Vance, but my patience has its limits. You have 1 hour. Then I'm calling the sanitation department. I'm sure they'll be happy to take care of your things." He turned his back on her then, satisfied that he had made his position clear. The conflict was, in his mind, over. He had won. He did not understand that for Eleanor the fight was not about the house. It was about the small wooden box now lying precariously on its side in the snow. Inside that simple, unadorned box lay Frank's dignity. As she reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth wood, memories flooded her. A current strong enough to pull her back from the brink of despair. The box had sat on the mantelpiece for 40 years. Frank rarely opened it, but she would sometimes see him standing before it, his hand resting on the lid, his thoughts 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. He had been a mechanic, a man who understood the intricate workings of engines and the simple mechanics of honor. His hands, though often stained with grease, were the gentlest hands she had ever known. They had fixed her bicycle when she was a girl, held hers at the altar, and smoothed her hair as she slept. "Dignity, Ellie," he used to say, his voice a low, comforting rumble as they sat on the porch swing in the evenings. "It's the one thing they can't take from you. Money, houses, jobs, they can all go. But dignity, you have to give that away. Don't you ever give it away." He'd learned that lesson in the mud and rain of a war he never spoke about, a conflict that had shaped the quiet steel in his spine. The medals inside the box, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, were not trophies to him. They were anchors, reminders of promises kept and sacrifices made. They were the physical manifestation of his code. After the war, he found his peace in the roar of a Harley-Davidson engine. He loved the freedom of the open road, the brotherhood of the ride. He never officially joined a club, never wore a patch, but the garage he ran became a sanctuary for bikers from all walks of life. He treated every man, whether he rode a gleaming new machine or a rust bucket held together with wire and hope, with the same quiet respect. He'd spend hours helping a young rider tune a carburetor, often refusing payment beyond a handshake and a shared cup of coffee. He understood that the leather and the noise were just armor for hearts that were often as complex and vulnerable as any engine he worked on. They weren't customers. They were his tribe. The medical bills had started as a trickle and ended as a flood. Frank's illness was long and cruel, slowly stealing the strength from his body but never touching the core of his spirit. Eleanor sold her car, then her jewelry, then cashed in their small savings. She took on extra shifts cleaning offices at night, her body aching with a fatigue that was more than physical. She never told Frank the extent of their financial ruin. It was her final gift to him, to allow him to face his end without the added burden of shame. She would protect his dignity even from the truth. After he was gone, the house was all she had left of him, a shell filled with the echoes of his laughter and the scent of his old leather jacket, which still hung in the closet. Now even that was being taken. Kneeling in the snow, clutching the box of his medals, she remembered his words. "Don't you ever give it away." She would not. She would not scream. She would not weep. She would not give Mr. Sterling the satisfaction of her surrender. The sky, which had been spitting lazy flakes, opened up. The snow began to fall in thick, wet sheets, driven by a wind that moaned through the bare branches of the oak trees lining the street. It coated Eleanor's thin coat, melted on her gray hair, and turned the scattered photographs into pale, blurry squares of forgotten time. Mr. Sterling, seeing the weather turn, grew visibly agitated. This was taking too long. The clean, efficient process he had envisioned had devolved into a messy, protracted ordeal. "An hour, Mrs. Vance," he shouted over the wind, his voice thin and reedy against the storm's power. "That was the deal. The truck will be here, and whatever is left on this lawn becomes city property." His threat was aimed not just at her, but at the silent houses, a warning against any nascent thoughts of intervention. The pressure was immense, a physical weight pressing down on her. Each gust of wind felt like a shove. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It was in her bones, a deep, resonant ache. The task before her was Sisyphean. For every item she managed to drag to the curb, the snow seemed to reveal another, half-buried and frozen to the ground. Her life had become a frozen, chaotic ruin. From inside their warm homes, the neighbors watched the storm and the woman. Mrs. Gable in number 12, a woman Eleanor had always shared a polite hello with, felt a pang of something sharp and uncomfortable in her chest. Guilt. She thought of going out, of offering a cup of tea, a blanket, anything. But then she thought of Mr. Sterling. He owned half the properties on this block. To cross him was to invite trouble, and she had her own family, her own problems to worry about. She pulled her curtains shut, but she couldn't shut out the image of Eleanor's small, determined figure against the swirling white. Across the street, a young man named Kevin stared from his bedroom window. He saw the landlord's expensive coat and the widow's thin one. He saw the deliberate, methodical way she was trying to salvage her memories while the man who was taking her home just watched, annoyed. He felt a hot surge of anger, but it was followed by a cold wave of helplessness. What could he do? He was just a kid. Arguing with a man like Sterling would be pointless, maybe even dangerous. And so, like everyone else, he just watched. The community's silence was a form of consensus. It was a collective decision to not get involved, an unspoken agreement that this woman's tragedy was hers and hers alone. Eleanor felt their silence more keenly than the wind. It was a different kind of cold, one that hollowed her out from the inside. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a ghost haunting the wreckage of her own life while the world stayed safely behind its glass. She picked up a small, chipped porcelain bird, a gift from Frank long ago, its delicate form almost lost in the snow. She held it in her palm, her fingers wrapped around it, as if its fragile strength could somehow become her own. Amidst the swirling snow and quiet despair, a new figure entered the scene. It was a dog, a scruffy terrier mix with a matted coat and a noticeable limp. It moved with a cautious, hesitant gait, drawn in by the human activity but wary of it. It was a stray, one of the neighborhood's forgotten creatures, its ribs a faint outline beneath its fur. It stopped a few feet from the pile of belongings, its head cocked, its dark eyes watching the scene with an intelligence born of hardship. It shivered, not just from the cold, but from a deep, instinctual fear of the world. Sterling noticed the dog instantly. To him, it was just another piece of filth marring his property. "Get out of here," he snapped, taking a step towards it. He didn't kick the animal, but he kicked a spray of snow and ice in its direction. "Go on, get, filthy mutt." The dog yelped, a thin, pathetic sound, and scrambled backward, its limp more pronounced as it tried to flee. Eleanor saw it all. She saw the casual cruelty, the dismissal of a small, suffering life. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. Her own pain, vast and overwhelming as it was, receded for a moment, replaced by a fierce, protective empathy for the terrified animal. She stopped her work. She ignored Sterling's impatient glare. Slowly, as not to frighten the dog, she reached into the deep pocket of her coat. Her fingers found the familiar shape of the wax paper package. Inside was half a tuna sandwich, the bread slightly stale. It was all she had. It was meant to be her dinner, her only meal for the day. Without a second of hesitation, she unwrapped it. The smell of tuna, faint as it was, reached the dog, and it stopped its retreat, its nose twitching. Eleanor knelt again, her knees sinking into the freezing snow. She held out the piece of sandwich in her open palm, her expression soft, her voice a low murmur. "Here you go, boy. It's okay. Come on." The dog watched her, its fear warring with its hunger. It took a hesitant step forward, then another. Sterling watched in disgust. "What are you doing? Don't encourage it," he barked. Eleanor didn't even look at him. Her entire focus was on the animal. Finally, the dog darted forward, snatched the sandwich from her hand with a surprising gentleness, and retreated a few feet to devour it in grateful, desperate gulps. In the vast landscape of her loss, in the face of her public humiliation, Eleanor Vance had chosen to give away the last thing she had to a creature even more lost than herself. It was an act of profound, almost reckless, compassion. An act of pure, unshakable dignity. Across the street, Kevin saw the whole exchange. He saw the landlord's cruelty and the widow's kindness. He watched as she offered her last meal to a stray dog while her own life lay in ruins around her. The image struck him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a nice gesture. It was a testament. It was a declaration of character so powerful it made the walls of his room feel like a cage. The shame he had felt before now burned white-hot. His inaction, his silence, suddenly felt like a profound moral failure. He turned from the window, his heart pounding. "Mom," he said, his voice tight. "That woman, Mrs. Vance. She gave her sandwich to a stray dog. I think it was all the food she had." His mother, who had been trying to ignore the scene outside, looked at him. She saw the look on her son's face and knew this was no longer something they could just watch. The story, whispered from Kevin to his mother, soon traveled. A quick phone call to the neighbor next door. A text message sent across the street. The curtain twitchers were now a network. The narrative was changing. It was no longer about a deadbeat tenant getting what she deserved. It was about a good woman, a kind woman, being crushed by a heartless man. The whispers turned the tide. The silent judgment that had been directed at Eleanor began to pivot, slowly but surely, toward Mr. Sterling. People started to look at his expensive coat and his flushed, angry face not with fear or deference, but with a growing contempt. One of the neighbors, a retired auto worker named George, had seen enough. He remembered Frank Vance. He remembered him as a straight shooter, a man who would always lend a tool or a hand and never ask for anything in return. He remembered Frank talking about his biker friends, the rough-looking men who would show up at his garage and be treated like family. George went to his phone, his fingers scrolling through an old contact list. He found a number for a man he knew only as Road Dog, a man who ran a custom bike shop 2 towns over. He hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. "Road Dog," he said when a gruff voice answered. "It's George, from the old plant. Listen, you're not going to believe what's happening over here on Maple Street. It's about Frank Vance's wife." The atmosphere on the street was shifting, charging with a new energy. The snow was still falling, but the air no longer felt empty, felt like it was waiting. The first hint was not a sight, but a sound. It began as a low, almost subsonic vibration that hummed through the soles of their shoes, a deep thrumming that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a sound that didn't belong in the quiet, snow-muffled world of Maple Street. Mr. Sterling paused, his head cocked in annoyance, assuming it was a snowplow. But the sound grew, deepening and multiplying, becoming a complex, layered roar. It wasn't one engine. It was a symphony of them, a rolling thunder that rattled the windows in their frames and sent a flock of sparrows scattering from a snow-laden pine tree. Every head on the street turned towards the source of the sound. Then they appeared. At the far end of the block, a single headlight cut through the swirling snow. It was followed by 2 more, then 4, then a dozen, until the entire entrance to the street was a constellation of piercing, white lights. They came on slowly, with a deliberate, intimidating grace. A wave of polished chrome and black leather, Harley-Davidsons of every shape and size, their engines rumbling in a synchronized, menacing chorus. They filled the street from curb to curb, an unstoppable river of steel. They rolled past the silent, watching houses, their presence so immense, so alien, that it seemed to warp the reality of the quiet neighborhood. There were dozens of them, then scores. 100, 200, 250 motorcycles parking in tight, disciplined rows, blocking off the street entirely. The engines cut out, one by one, the sudden silence as jarring as the preceding noise. For a moment nothing happened. Then, in near-perfect unison, the riders dismounted. They were large men, most of them bearded, all of them wearing the heavy leather cuts of the Hells Angels. The sight of the iconic death head patch, repeated over and over, sent a wave of fear through the neighborhood. These were not men you crossed. They moved with a quiet purpose, their boots crunching on the snow. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. They formed a wide, silent semicircle at the edge of the lawn, their collective gaze falling upon the scene. The scattered belongings, the shivering widow, and the well-dressed landlord who now looked very, very small. Mr. Sterling's face had gone from flushed pink to a pasty, bloodless white. His self-assurance, so robust just moments before, had completely evaporated, leaving behind a raw, primal fear. He was no longer in control. From the center of the intimidating line of bikers, one man stepped forward. He was older than the rest, his long beard more gray than black, and the lines around his eyes spoke of countless miles and hard-won wisdom. The patch on his vest identified him as Preacher. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his eyes scanning the wreckage on the lawn. He walked right past Mr. Sterling, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a garden gnome. He stopped directly in front of Eleanor, who was still on her knees, clutching the wooden box. His shadow fell over her. He looked down, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then his hard features softened with something that looked like pained recognition. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low gravel, like stones rolling in a deep riverbed. It was a voice accustomed to being heard over the roar of engines. "Ma'am," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Are you Eleanor Vance?" "Frank Vance's wife." Eleanor looked up, startled, and nodded, unable to find her own voice. Preacher's gaze fell to the wooden box in her hands, then to a half-buried photograph of Frank leaning against his old panhead. A flicker of memory, of profound respect, crossed his face. "We heard there was some trouble." The truth, when it came, was not a secret whispered but a testament declared for all to hear. Preacher turned slightly, so his voice would carry not just to Eleanor, but to the bikers behind him and the neighbors now tentatively emerging from their homes. "Frank Vance," he said, the name spoken like a prayer, "was a brother. He never wore our patch, but he had the heart of an angel. He was a man of honor." He pointed a thick, gloved finger toward a burly biker standing nearby. 20 years ago, that man there, my brother Cutter, was in a bad way. Laid his bike down on the interstate, pinned underneath with the engine on fire. Frank saw it happen. He ran across 4 lanes of traffic, pulled Cutter out of the fire with his bare hands, and stayed with him until the ambulance came. Never asked for a dime. Never even told anyone his last name. Just said, "That's what you do for a brother." Another biker stepped forward. "My first bike. A real piece of junk. Frank spent a whole weekend in his garage with me, teaching me how to rebuild the engine. Said the knowledge was worth more than money. He was right. Story after story began to emerge from the crowd of leather-clad men. Frank had lent money he didn't have to a writer whose wife was sick. He had co-signed a loan for a young prospect trying to open a shop. He had been a mentor, a friend, a silent pillar of a community that lived by a code of loyalty that outsiders could never understand. The young man who had made the initial call, Kevin, learned that his own father, a long-haul trucker, had once been helped by Frank when his rig broke down in a winter storm. Frank Vance had spent a lifetime making quiet deposits of kindness and respect into the world. Now his account was coming due with interest. Preacher looked from Eleanor to the scattered belongings, his eyes hardening as they finally settled on Mr. Sterling. "This isn't just a house," he growled. "This is a memorial, and you are desecrating it." Preacher took a slow step toward Mr. Sterling, who instinctively tried to shrink away. The landlord was a man used to wielding power through contracts and legal threats, but that currency had no value here. He was facing a power that was older, more elemental. "We're not here to hurt you," Preacher said, his voice dangerously calm. "We're here to fix what you broke." He turned and nodded to his brothers. From the saddlebags of their bikes they produced not weapons but tools. Shovels, hammers, heavy-duty trash bags. They had come prepared for a different kind of war, a war against indignity. What followed was a spectacle of disciplined, reverent labor. The bikers, these fearsome-looking men, began to move Eleanor's belongings. They did it with a care that bordered on tenderness. For men lifted the old floral armchair as if it were a throne, carrying it carefully up the steps and back through the doorway. Others fanned out across the lawn, meticulously gathering every last photograph, brushing the snow from each one before placing it into a new, sturdy box. They worked in near silence, a well-oiled machine of restitution. The sound was of boots crunching in the snow, the scrape of shovels, and the quiet murmur of instructions. They were not just cleaning up a mess. They were restoring a life. This silent, powerful act of solidarity finally broke the spell that had held the neighborhood captive. The shame that had kept them indoors now propelled them out. Kevin was the first to act, emerging from his house with 2 shovels, offering one to his father. Then George, the retired auto worker, appeared with a thermos of hot coffee. Soon, a dozen neighbors were on the lawn, working alongside the bikers. Mrs. Gable brought out a stack of warm blankets. The teenager who had been filming earlier was now using his phone as a flashlight to help men see into the dark corners of the porch. The community, once fractured by fear and apathy, was being welded together by a shared purpose. They were no longer just observers. They were participants in the reclamation of Eleanor Vance's home, and in doing so, they were reclaiming a piece of their own humanity. Mr. Sterling stood alone, a ghost at the edge of the scene, utterly powerless and irrelevant. The bikers ignored him and the neighbors looked right through him. His authority had vanished, exposed as the fragile, hollow thing it had always been. In less than an hour, the lawn was clear. Every box, every piece of furniture, every scattered memento was back inside the small house. A few of the bikers, who evidently knew their way around a toolbox, had fixed the broken porch light and rehung a screen door that had been knocked off its hinges. Someone had found kindling and started a small, cheerful fire in the hearth, its warm glow now visible through the front window. The house, which had looked so dark and dead, was alive again. Eleanor stood on her porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket a neighbor had given her, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. She watched the quiet, efficient work of the strangers and neighbors, her heart a painful, swelling mix of gratitude and disbelief. The profound loneliness that had consumed her was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of connection. Preacher approached her again, his boots making no sound on the freshly swept porch. He stopped before her, his sheer size seeming to block out the last of the biting wind. He reached up and, with a series of deliberate movements, undid the clasps on his leather cut. The vest was heavy, worn from years on the road, adorned with patches that told the story of his life. It was his identity, his flag, the most sacred object he owned. He took it off and gently draped it over Eleanor's small shoulders. It was far too big for her, enveloping her like a protective shield. "Frank was family," Preacher said, his voice thick with emotion. "That makes you family. No one is ever going to bother you again. This is our guarantee." It was the highest honor he could bestow, a public declaration of adoption into their tribe. He then turned his attention to Mr. Sterling one last time. The landlord stood shivering, his expensive coat now looking like a cheap costume. Preacher didn't walk over to him. He simply spoke from the porch, his voice carrying with absolute authority. "The rent on this house is paid. From now on, you'll receive a check on the 1st of every month. You will accept it, and you will never harass Mrs. Vance again. You will not call. You will not write. You will not set foot on this property. Do you understand me?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Sterling could only manage a jerky, terrified nod. With their work done, the bikers began to move back to their machines. There were no loud goodbyes, just quiet nods to Eleanor and to the neighbors who had helped. A bond had been forged in the cold, an unspoken understanding that would forever change the fabric of the street. Then the engines started. One by one, they roared to life, a deafening, triumphant chorus that vibrated through the entire neighborhood. But they didn't leave immediately. In a final, powerful display of solidarity, the entire procession of 250 motorcycles began to move, circling the block in a slow, honor guard parade. Their headlights cut through the falling darkness, a moving wall of light and steel, a protective cordon around Eleanor's home. Then, with a final, collective roar, they turned onto the main road and thundered off into the night, their taillights disappearing like a constellation of receding red stars. The street fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with the lingering echo of respect. Eleanor Vance stood on her porch, the heavy leather vest warming her more than any fire could, and watched them go. At her feet, the stray dog, now curled up on the welcome mat, lifted its head, gave a soft sigh, and went back to sleep, finally home. The snow had stopped falling, and the winter sky was beginning to clear, revealing the first bright star.